Let's go. So here we are again, and welcome everybody. It's Wednesday afternoon, and welcome to the new normal webinar discussion panel. And this week our discussion is around predicting transformation program success. Really interesting topic, particularly given the amount of programs that are kicking into gear this year and have been doing over many years, and even more are predicted to be happening around all sorts of businesses in light of COVID, post-COVID, post-Brexit, whatever. There's lots of change going on. If you're new to the webinar series, welcome, good afternoon. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to you continuing with us through. If you've been here regular, thanks again. As always, please make it interactive. There is the chat box in the bottom of the screen. Please ask any questions, offer any opinions, contradictions, whatever, to what we're talking about, and we will pick up on that and we'll try to weave it into the discussions as we go. So once again, thanks very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to Shahid to go through the agenda for today.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to the New Normal webinar. The New Normal webinar, the background to this is Steve and I started this back in March of 2020 as a response to what we realized was a changing set of circumstances, considerable change. We realized that in order to get through this kind of unknown future that we were entering into, we were going to have to step up our game around knowledge, around tactics or ways of coping with the various technology, societal, etc. changes which were going to be prevalent for all of us. So what Steve and I decided to do is reach out into our networks, access some of the great professionals that we're been working with in the past or currently, and try and engage them in a discussion around their subject matters, their specialisms, and how we might share that knowledge, not only to upgrade Steve and I, because first and foremost, Steve and I were looking to try and cope better with what was coming or being laid out in front of us. But we were also wanting to develop a community as well. So along that journey of knowledge acquisition and sharing, we wanted to build up a community and share with you in the New Normal webinar all of this this great insight, these new coping mechanisms, these new processes and technologies. And we've covered a vast array of subjects, from technology for the disabled at work through to the use of artificial intelligence in systems and processes, through to chemistry, group chemistry, and how to make dynamic situations with multiple participants and team members work for you. So all of that has been covered by us. We're each week going to continue trying to delve into great insight, great knowledge. And this week's subject is, I have to say personally, one of the most fascinating for me, because I've been involved in a lot of change programs, a lot of heavy investment by organizations, and it doesn't always go well. And what Jon Crews, our guest speaker, and he'll introduce himself in a second, is promising us, or certainly alluding to in this innovation he's created, this prediction tool, is there may be ways, there may be signposts early on in a program which will help you to figure out where some of the areas of concentration might give you the best return to improve success on programs and transformations. So I'm fascinated by this. There will be a Q&A all the way through. As Steve has said, there's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you take a look at that, by all means, enter in your comments or your challenges. If you hear things you like, let us know. If you hear things that you want to challenge, by all means, put out your challenges. We'll put it to the panel and we'll ask Jon about those areas. At the end of the session, we will go through what's known as a resource page. Steve and I, along with the team, Lucas, Joanna, and Claire, what we do is we produce and we promise each week a resource page. It's a document with further insight, use cases, references, white papers, video links to the subject for that week. And it's our way of sharing with you and giving you resources where you can onward share the subject. At the end of the session, we will give you an indication of what next week's webinar will be. Of course, we'd be interested in you sharing that and joining us again if you've enjoyed this week's episode, because we want to build this community. We want to spread the good news, and we want your participation, because your participation, your engagement with us makes all of this worthwhile and makes what has been the past 41 weeks of webinars so enjoyable and so worthwhile. And this, our 42nd, I think it is this week. We're looking forward to that even more. So thank you very much. I'll hand it back over to Steve for the introductions.
42nd. Wow, it's quite impressive, isn't it? Okay, so falls to me to set the context as fairly regular. We had a similar sort of discussion a few weeks ago prior to Christmas, where we discussed about adoption as part of projects. So it wasn't so much about the projects as they are going on and whether they're delivering. It was more around whether they were going to be adopted, and that was determining whether it was success or failure of a project. It was interesting to do a little bit of research to see out there, because there's all sorts of figures that are bandied around about success rates of transformation projects, around success rates of ERP, around success rates of all sorts. And there tends to be in many places a really, really bleak picture of success of them. But actually, BDO Digital did a really good research, and they found, overwhelmingly that they're moderately successful. That overwhelmingly they achieve the expected business outcomes in a lot of the projects. A very small percentage, a relatively small percentage, are overwhelmingly successful and the business outcomes surpass the expectations, and 15% are classed as failure. Whereas another McKinsey said 70% of all transformation projects fail. But I think there's one line that I think says a lot about where we determine whether a project is a success or a failure. And John's going to go into this in a lot more detail, but my personal thought is that a project is considered a failure when it has not delivered what was required in line with expectations. And one of the key words from my experience is that very last word in that sentence, in that phrase, is all around expectations. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have, and I've had all the years that I've been doing this sort of thing, is around where we have expectations misaligned, and then we have lots of issues with around that, and then things get determined a failure. However, John is going to talk about even more in detail about the type of things that he discovers with his model, and that he can predict whether things are going to be successful and how successful they're going to be. We have our 5 points on a slide, as usual, our discussion points. It's not structured, it's not an agenda, but what it is are the elements that we're going to be talking about, and John's going to use a few slides to support the discussion. So we're going to talk about what are the determinants of success. We're going to look at what are the consequences of variance to those. So if you're better, worse, whatever, how can you, what will that determine? We're going to go through some of the predicting and monitoring that John's tools allows you to do, so regular predictions based upon where you're currently at. And then how you would take back control. So one of the things being, if it isn't going right, then how do we do it? And then we build into that is some of the cultural, those sort of impacts within the business for admitting and then following up. And then we're going to just have a brief look at the end on and look at a bit more as, well, what else can we apply? What if we applied the likes of the business chemistry we talked about last week and the impacts on that, and how can that take us to where we want to be? But enough about me and us. John, do you want to welcome to the party, and do you want to give a brief introduction of yourself before we launch into your tale?
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Jon Crews. I'm a management consultant, and I think I've been doing this for about 30 years. The first half, all my career has been based on helping clients improve their business performance by implementing change programs with a large component of technology. So the first half of my career was primarily in delivery roles. So I started as a programmer and then have moved into project leading, project and program management. But then the second half of my career morphed into what I'd call more advisory a more advisory function, still working with clients and their change programs, but primarily reviewing programs, giving advice on programs, and occasionally still dipping back in and helping customers recover or repair those programs if they were going awry. So when I set up my own consultancy in 2014, I had two goals. The first goal was to try and make the review process, sort of the QA process for programs, as simple and as painless for customers and clients as possible. The goal being that if there was a simple, pain-free process, clients could effectively review their own programs more often, therefore sort of being able to take corrective action sort of earlier in the process. And then I thought, well, actually, if you're going to do that, my second goal was then to say, well, if we could exploit the predictive nature of technology, wouldn't it be great if these tools could not only show you your program at a snapshot in time, but also allow you to play the program forward to see what would happen if you maybe didn't manage the risks and to assess your trajectory. And that's led me to my sort of the diagnostics I have today.
Interesting, and that's good. And so should we start and let you show everybody what you've got, as in a manner of speaking?
Well, I have three slides in the first instance. The two describe the models that I use, and the third one illustrates what happens if you wrap those up into a diagnostic. So what I'd like to start with, as a consultant, obviously I need a 2x2 grid, and I built this based on the observation that if you're delivering programs of change, fundamentally your success or otherwise is based on two prime factors. The first is how good are your program team at actually delivering stuff and getting stuff done. But then the second dimension is how well does that program entity engage the wider stakeholders within the business. And that gives us those two dimensions give us a sort of 2x2 grid. And I would suggest that our audience could take pretty much any program they've worked with and put it somewhere on that grid. So for example, if you're not particularly good at delivery and your programs don't engage the stakeholders, you end up with program failure. I don't think anyone would argue with that. But of course, a lot of people are very good at program delivery, and they do the right engagement, and they do end up delivering great results, and that's in the top right-hand box. But then again, along the diagonal, I think we've all experienced where the program delivery sort of the train starts running, stakeholders maybe aren't engaged as well as they could, and what you end up with is those technical solutions delivered, but actually the business aren't that engaged and maybe don't take up the solution. And then in the bottom right category, where the stakeholders really want the solution but delivery is not great, you end up with very frustrated stakeholders, and then the program is somewhat in jeopardy. So that's the starting point. But then, of course, programs aren't static things. So if we go on to the second slide. Because programs, especially if they take a certain amount of time, if they're 2 or 3 year initiatives, they are subject to internal and external forces, which mean that their situation is quite dynamic. And what we find is that just because you're good at delivery for one period of the program might not mean that you then go on to be consistently good. But also the two dimensions of delivery and engagement interact with each other. So for example, if you're good at delivery but not good at engagement, you might find that your stakeholders start to lose interest in the program, or maybe external events overtake the program. So actually, no matter how good you are at delivering stuff, your program's still going to drop into the bottom left-hand box where it's going to run into trouble. So you can end up with these vicious circles, but also virtuous circles. So in the top right-hand box, you end up with a scenario that if you're good at delivering stuff and you engage your customers, if you deliver, say, quick wins, the stakeholders like what they see, you end up with more support, more people getting on board, more budget, which means that the program can do even better things. And then there are some interesting scenarios in the sort of the bottom right-hand case where if you're not particularly good at delivery, and the stakeholders aren't maybe that engaged, again, you'll drift into troubled waters where the program will normally end up being sort of dissolved. And there is an interesting scenario on the bottom right-hand side where if you're not good at delivery, but the stakeholders they really need what you're doing, then you end up with a scenario where the program goes into recovery, the initial program team might be sidelined and a new team brought in, and the business will drag the program over the line with sort of with a high body count that goes with that.
Interesting question, John, that Richard's just asked. He said, he's asking, is the language of program and project with defined start and ends a bit outdated? Isn't the approach and context of modern transformations much more iterative, agile, and therefore embodies a spirit learn fast and pivot fast? We can reflect that in this sort of views as well, can't you?
You can, and that point I think is a more detailed point, which I'd like to cover later on if that's possible. Definitely.
Store it in the mind.
My last point on this slide is that what comes out of this analysis is that actually programs do follow, although every program is different, programs do actually follow a set of defined scenarios. I use 7 of them, but there may be more. And therefore, if you can assess your program at any particular point in time and work out which scenario the program is operating in, you can then make a pretty good prediction about what's going to happen to that program in future, because the scenarios are predictable. And therefore, if you align your program with a scenario, you can predict what's going to happen to it. So I've built this methodology into a diagnostic, and my next slide is, or the final slide, just shows, this is from a case study where I was working with a client on various programs that they were doing. And they had one program which was in difficulty. It had been running for 18 months and was struggling to almost get out of the analysis phase. They're at their first phase. So I did the assessment, and what this slide doesn't show you is that the diagnostic also throws out all the risks that it associates with the program. And it concluded that they weren't very good at delivery, but unless they improved by doing certain things, they were going to start losing stakeholder engagement, and therefore they were going to actually go in the wrong direction. They were going to go back towards failure. So I made a set of recommendations which weren't taken up. They said, no, we don't want to do any of that. So I came back in 6 months' time, reviewed the same program, and found that, lo and behold, the stakeholder engagement had deteriorated. People weren't turning up to governance meetings, and actually resources were starting to be removed from the program, and delivery was getting even worse. And they basically done a replan to fit the program into the remaining available time.
So John, sorry to interrupt. Just for my and the audience's benefit, the left-hand diagram with the red dot, that shows the first assessment when you went into that program,
yeah,
and looked at it on the first time that you were able to view it, and you
Yeah.
assessed that they were bordering on failure at that point. So they were in the failing quadrant, but they were on the border. They could still turn it round.
Yes.
Then you came back. They didn't take your recommendations for course correction and upskilling the team and various stakeholder engagements, I would have thought. And so what you did was you came back 6 months later and you did the assessment again, and you showed that the second red dot is the travel or the decline in the program outcomes to even more likely failure of the program.
Yes, their situation had deteriorated over 6 months,
Okay.
and it was demonstrable with the evidence. So those are my first 3 slides. I have two more detailed ones on the diagnostics, which we can come to later if you'd like to. But that was as far as I was going to go as an introduction.
No, absolutely, and I think it's interesting. I think just winding back to Richard's point about for the fast and the more pivoting program, we can still apply this. It just has to be applied, more rigorously, because regardless the method that you're doing, you still have to have a capability of delivering, and you still have to have engagement, whatever you're doing anyway, presumably. Which is, it's easy to still throw money away in rapid turnaround, agile, whatever projects. And in fact, one of the terms that Richard used there is one of my pet favorite words, is where the term agile is used. And I'm sure, Richard, you used it. All your agile projects were wonderful and worked according to the agile principles. But I see it used so many times where people just haven't defined exactly what they're trying to achieve. And agile becomes an excuse for saying we don't know what we're doing and we're reappraising every day, which is not exactly where we want to be. So what is the shortest time period you could do assess, reassess, John?
Well, if the program, say you've got a 2 or 3 year program, then quarterly, I think, would be a reasonable approach. I work with a multi-year program, and every month we'd assess where they were, because they knew they were trying to build capability as they went along. So we actually had a monthly checkpoint where every month we tried to introduce a few new capabilities into the program team. But you wouldn't want to leave it more than 3 months.
What about quicker? What if we've got something that we're trying to deliver something and pivot fast to something I'm using the word pivot again, where we're trying to do something quick and we want to get there, and it's a 6 month and it's a 6 month turnaround. That can go wrong just as quickly as it can deliver quickly, can't it?
Well, in that case, I think the principles of engagement are the same. And in some cases, you can get a particularly fast delivery project, which gets to its ta-da moment, and the stakeholders basically aren't ready for it. And I grew up in the early days of rapid systems development as it morphed in through DSDM into Agile. And I love Agile. I love the 4-week sprint. But one of my observations is that to have that flexibility, you really need to have a bit of structure at the beginning and the end of your activity. So, for example, one of the common things I find, I reviewed a program a couple of years ago, which was an agile technology program, but the problem was it had long forgotten its business case. It had been through about 5 project managers, everyone doing sort of the agile stuff, and it had accumulated activities and scope as it had gone, and the original discipline of what is the business case, why are we doing this, and what are the benefits had long been sort of neglected. So this thing had become a sort of monster rampaging through the organization, sucking up resource, and people were afraid to stop it. So I certainly believe Agile is fantastic, but I would counsel a discipline at the beginning around the business case, and at the end in terms of sort of the benefits delivery.
So a couple of questions for you, John. Firstly, when I was looking at the scenarios, the 7 scenarios, I was getting goosebumps actually, because I've got a 25 year project or program history, and I recognize a lot of those scenarios. So what you've done is you've captured what I guess a lot of us have experienced and probably are processing in a generic or a general form. You've captured it in its essence and identified it. And we can recognize that, a lot of us on this call. So that really fascinates me in the first instance, because you're right, that's programs have certain scenarios or characteristics. And if those characteristics have an element of predictability, then knowing that early in the program, surely that can help the program leadership in its resource composition, its stakeholder engagement, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a great element for me. The second thing I want to point out is a question really from Suzanne. Suzanne's pointing out that users, end users, and the ability to engage them in change transformations is often critical to getting a successful change transformation completed. When you list engagement capability on one of your axes, engagement capability, does that include end users as part of that stakeholder?
Yes, I mean, it's probably best to illustrate this by, if I show one of the slide with one of the first tool, which is a sort of general organizational capability. Diagnostics. So the purpose of this is to provide, rather than looking at a specific program, it just allows you to do a general assessment of how good your organization is. And it's based on 2 competency models, one based around delivery and one based around engagement. And you can see on the left-hand side the components of each of those competency assessments. And this is available on my website, and you can just type in or click on what applies to your business, and it'll give you the most common scenario that you probably expect and where you are on the old grid. And the delivery
is that your website at the bottom there? Projonix.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So the delivery competencies are around the things that the program would need to do. So the business case is in there, having an architecture and an end state defined, being able to plan and estimate, having a delivery focus, that's sort of driving through things rather than just administrating the process, actually managing your resources, people, money, time, mitigating risks and dependencies, and having some sort of plan to release benefits at the end. In terms of the engagement competencies, this is where, whether it's your end users, whether it's your wider business, whether it's your leadership team, there's a whole collection of things that you need to do. So creating the case for change, which is actually creating the argument to explain to people, why do we need to do this in the first place? Designing the future business, so that's around sort of target operating models, process and organizational, and identifying process and organizational changes, which would probably have a big impact on your end users. Making sure your leadership are bought into it, working out how you engage the staff. So that's all about making the change real for them, showing them why they're going to benefit from whatever is going to emerge from this program. Yeah. Rolling out new ways of working, so that might be new processes or new job descriptions, and then reinforcing behaviors, which is all about the culture side of things. So there are many things you need to do and get right if you're going to be best in class. But those are the high level sort of categories that people need to consider.
I'm intrigued, and I think I mentioned this before we got onto it. There's a couple of points there that I've seen over the years, which is one is business case, and I'm a crusty old cynic on having seen business cases over the years. They fell into 2 categories, and I even used to ask clients at some stages, is this a business case purely to secure the funding to enable you to do the project, or is it a business case you're going to live by, and actually we're then going to measure, which if it's the latter, then you at least will then be tied into your releasing of the benefits in your first stage. But I've been a bit of a cynic because I've seen so many business cases that have been around just securing budget, and then designing the future business. And I think that's the business, and also in a number of cases where we're seeing designing the IT operating model as well around it. And what do you actually want to operate? This is assuming it's a technology-based project, and understanding the change not only through the business from operating the solution, but the change within potentially the IT department or the IT function who's going to then support it. And we're going to see nothing greater than obviously cloud and things like that is really changing those models.
Yeah, and I think cloud's a really interesting one, because I mean, I've just done a cloud strategy for a client, and we came at that strategy looking at it as a change, because moving your organization from on-premise to cloud is a big old change, and of course the challenge there is to say, well, actually the focus is not there's obviously a massive technology component, but there are organizational and process changes and policy changes. You do need to embrace the world of DevOps. So you are changing the skills and competencies of your developers, and you need to consider all that as well. So change, yes, it pervades pretty much every IT project, whether you want it to or not.
Yeah, really interesting question from Jeremy just pinged up there about questions. What about the program delivery history, probably of the client? Because there are cases, and I can give examples from the past, and presumably others can, where we've been involved on one side or the other, and we've seen clients that have changed, say, delivery partners twice as they've been going through, and actually the problem tends not to be the delivery partner, but the problem tends to be the client themselves, and then you have to deal with that one. And so do they have a history of succeeding as well? And also a really interesting one, how do the prioritization against competitive programs for the resources you need, is that factored in somewhere into all of this as well?
Okay, there's a couple of things there. So the competitive programs, I'll answer that one directly. Yes, the more detailed program diagnostic specifically asks about competing initiatives, because no matter how good your program is and how great it's going to be, if the business, as they do, get distracted or X priorities change, you can be you can be in trouble at that point. And going back to then the question about, or your point about the organization's ability to deliver change, I find it amazing that, I mean, part of the reason for adopting a dynamic approach is that you can get organizations who've historically been very, very good and disciplined about programs, but that doesn't mean that that everything they do in future will be, because you can get scenarios where, for example, external factors. So the business has its strategy, it's delivering its program, but then external factors mean that the strategy needs to change and the program has to adapt. And I've seen cases where the business has changed to the extent that the business case for the program has become invalid overnight, and then you're left with a big challenge about what do you try and do? Because your reason why has disappeared, do you stop the program? Do you try and pivot it? So programs are sort of vulnerable to factors beyond their own control.
There's a question. Sorry. Yeah, there's a question here from Jeremy about program histories. So as all of us know, we've worked at various organizations. Some are better than others at change management and change transformation programs. Is program history something which you'd built into your model, or is program history perhaps not a defining factor in predicting that program with that detail around the skills in the group and their engagement with the business?
So the more detailed diagnostic works by taking at a more detail, it uses the same competencies, but it takes them into more detail. And clearly, if a program is not particularly competent at planning and estimating or developing business cases, then it's a good indicator that if you start a program, you're going to struggle. And I have used the thing I like about the competency framework is that quite often if you arrive on a program, you can give the competency model to different people in the program, get them to fill it in, and then you see where people agree or disagree. And because there's no absolute sort of answer, so what you can spot is organizations that are potentially overconfident, and you can also spot where there are stakeholders who aren't confident, which itself is an issue, because if you're going to be a successful program, you need to have stakeholders that are both aligned with your goals and also confident that you're going to deliver. So, and this is why these aren't individual factors; they all influence each other and need to be addressed.
So you've got, just for, again, clarity's sake for the audience, you've got a high-level overview of programs, which, as you said, people can access through your website at projonix.com.
Yeah.
So you put in some summary factors around a program which is live or, going through its change, and it will give you a assessment of that program. But what you're saying is that for the really detailed work, you've got, I don't know, I'm just saying for the sake of argument here, a factor of 5 in terms of input variables, which you look at in programs to determine a much more detailed, much more granular assessment of programs and the trajectory for that program.
Yes, I mean, I can show you on the next slide.
Yeah, please do.
Just a snapshot of how so for a program specific analysis, there's a diagnostic with about 100 questions on it. And I mean, there's some illustrated there. Or maybe I should put that diagram at the front. And each one, you can drop down the questions and answer yes, no, or maybe. It's based on the gut feel of whoever is filling in the diagnostic. It's not too challenging for the user at that perspective. But from that, it does 3 things. It sort of marks where it thinks you are now based on the question on the grid, based on where the questions you've asked. It calculates a direction of travel, of where you're likely to go. And it also gives a big long list of the most common risks based on the questions that you've answered. So yes, it does ask some very detailed questions about all aspects of the program.
So as an output, let's say I'm involved in the leadership for a program. We ask you to do the assessment, John. You go through the 100 questions with key stakeholders in the program, and then you will produce an output which looks like what's on the screen right now. It's a 2x2 grid with a assessment of where the program is right now, which quadrant, and then a trajectory or a direction of travel for the program based on the criteria or the variables which people have given as answers. And then very interestingly, I think for a program or a services team, what you've done is you've actually got most common risks and then some recommendations for what those risks would be based on that assessment.
Yes. So for every where it identifies that your program is suboptimal, it'll suggest the risk that you need to manage, and then you decide how to take that action forward.
Now I have to ask this because our audience are thinking this as well. This looks too good to be true, because many of us would, I mean, it's so valuable on a program, it's too good to be true. Can you tell us some of the validation that you've done for your tool? yeah, I understand you've shared it out amongst peers in other organizations.
Yes, so I use this. I have some associates who've used it to test programs that they were working on, and they've come back with sort of very positive comments. They haven't shared what the programs were, but they said the tool was scarily accurate. I use it myself, even when I'm doing sort of on-site reviewing programs with a sort of full report at the end, because I still like to use it as a ready reckoner to make sure I've got all the bases covered and I'm being nicely consistent. And yeah, people can. I mean, my goal is that eventually clients would just use it themselves, so that take me out of the loop, so that you know, whenever they feel that things aren't going particularly well, they can just check to get a sort of independent, self-served view.
Question from me, following on from Jeremy's in the chat, which is asking what audiences are the target for the questions. So stakeholders, users, program managers, etc. And then I'll come back with a follow-up.
So I mean, it's probably either program managers who want to check how they're doing against an external set of benchmarks, consultants who want to go off and review a program and want a second opinion, people who are sponsoring programs who feel that they're worried about the way it's going. So they could use the program specific diagnostic, but again, the more general capability models, I find that taking a leadership team through that assessment gives you a very interesting map, especially when you present back how they all, what they all think about the program. It's just a useful way of getting the real perceptions out there.
Yeah. So my follow-up to it then is, if we're asking the questions on the program diagnostic, how do you deal with the fact that people won't necessarily, want to come out bad or come out negative? So do they always tell the truth on everything?
I might interject there. I think one of the reasons why your yes, no, very limited range of answers, it kind of takes a lot of that away from people. Yes, people can still say yes when they mean no, but you've limited the options for the gray areas. Let me put it that way.
I mean, it's like when your doctor asks you how many units of alcohol do you drink. You can either be truthful or you can kid yourself, depending on what you want to get out of it. The questions, the goal has been to create enough questions so that it's very hard for people to game the system.
It's very, exactly. That's the key point, because I think.
And I would presume the bigger the sample set, the more people you interview, the more smoothing you'll achieve.
Yes, but also it's also useful if more than one person in the organisation contributes answers. It's playing that back to people to show the fact that there are different perspectives about essentially the same thing has value in itself.
I can see huge value in running this past the steerco and running it past the program managers and getting them all to complete it and see what the different answers come, where it spits out accordingly. I think that could be an interesting exercise, because that's where we sometimes see disconnects, don't we? And certainly to get engagement. And Alistair mentioned something earlier, which I guess is probably around the delivery capability that we would have to work out, but about selecting the SI involved and the procurement of the SI. And my guess is it's thinking about, it's capability, isn't it? It's how you're going to deliver it.
Yeah. So there are questions in there about are you engaging in external help to deliver this program, and then questions about are you holding, how are you managing those contracts? So you do get programs where we've signed the contract, we've now transferred all that risk to the supplier. Our job is done. But if the supplier fails, your program fails, and you're back at square one. So it does ask questions about your capabilities of managing the systems integrator, whether their methodology aligns with yours, and that type of thing. So it does go into that detail.
No, that's because I think that's important, because you can, how you're managing it. Have you passed off all the risk, which nobody can own like your business? And I like Mike's point, where it's all about communicating director of travel in a manner that every level of the business understands. And with a smiley face, terms like business transformation don't help at all. I'm with you on that one, Mike. I think it's very, very generic. I like talking about outcomes.
And to build on that, I would also say any change, transformation, or business program like this really needs to be talking about what it's doing for the business. What's the, as you say, business outcome? If you're a retailer, if you're a bank, if you're a oil and gas exploration company, what is it that's doing? What is it that's doing for your business, your mission as a business, or your customers? How is it doing something for them?
Yeah,
that's where it's going to begin.
Well, I see the other bit as well is, because by its very nature, anything that we discuss on this sort of thing and this sort of theme tends to be around things that aren't going well, and it's identifying things that aren't going well. But actually, it's also an opportunity to turbocharge. So even if you're going well, there's no reason why you can't go even better. And you could take it from higher up into that top right quadrant, or you could do other things and find out the bits. Are we doing well, and what could we do better? Rather than take it in a negative spin that too many of these projects all get viewed at, and it tends to be, how do we make it even better? Question that comes from me is, so on the analysis that you did, where the one that you mentioned previous, where you'd assessed it and then went back 6 months later and found that it had hit reverse and accelerated fast, going there. There's the challenge then of actually telling somebody that they've got an ugly baby, to use a common phrase, and then how do we go about addressing it, and how do we go about changing it? Do you find that people are receptive to that if they've engaged you in for this form of assessment, or do people get defensive, or what's your experience?
So in many cases, they're very, very receptive and very positive. And I mean, and it's rare that you show them just the output of the diagnostic without summarizing it into a more digestible format, which would include prioritizing things like the risks. But so what people are relieved that actually there might be a couple of key actions that they can take to get things back on track. And in many cases, as you pointed out, there are a lot of things that people do very well, and that's also good to play that back as well. Sometimes, normally, if programs tend to get handed from manager to manager as they go through their lifetime, sometimes those individuals can be in a certain amount of denial about the size of the challenge that they've picked up. But others do use the fact that they've just picked up a program as an opportunity to give it a good kick and get it into decent shape. So there are opportunities there. So almost every case is different.
Well, I'd see some of your...
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you've met Alistair back before, if you're on about people taking programs and giving them a good shake.
Well, Alistair's made a great point that he's done an assurance assessment on a particular program, and what he's been able to do is also highlight what's going well. So not only can you highlight what's going not so well and some areas for remediation, but if you can highlight for the customer what is going well, that's also motivation, it's also encouragement, etc.
Yeah.
And I presume your quadrant allows for that, right? Because if they're heading towards the top right-hand quadrant, especially if they've been assessed as underperforming in a previous assessment and then have taken corrective actions, and you can show them the direction of travel in the right direction. I presume that has a positive effect on program teams.
Yes, and I have done this where the net result was positive, and then the client's very much of, well, that's great news, but what are the few things that we could make even better, and then you can have a positive conversation about that. So yes, it does work like that as well.
Yeah, I worked in a previous life with a CIO who, when he took the reins at this global pharmaceutical company, I mean, it's one of the biggest in the world, massive organization, 100,000 people, 120 odd countries operation. And they were looking after IT centrally for all of those countries and all those people. And what he came in with was the mantra that the majority, I mean, he was talking consistently of 75% plus of IT programs fail. And what he was saying is measure your IT programs against time, cost, or quality. And quality, I presume he meant, objectives and alignment with the business, etc. So time, cost, and quality. And he would say across those three factors, 75% plus of IT programs fail. And I would imagine that if program leaders have the opportunity to do an assessment like this at a reasonable point, I'm not talking about the planning stage. I presume this kind of assessment, John, requires some wheels to be turning already in the project before you can actually start, measuring how are they doing, what direction are they moving in,
You can do a capability assessment of the organization at day one, but the program diagnostic assumes that things have been underway for a little period.
So you got to pick up Jeremy's question there, though, just to make sure we catch it, given time moving on as well. Is just building on the question on the one where it did show a downward trend after the second analysis. What did the client do after that? Did they actually take heed and change?
To be honest, I'm not sure, because I finished my involvement with them at that point. I know that some people left the company in the months after that. So I don't think it went particularly well, but I really can't comment on that.
Okay.
Well, it comes back to the scenarios or the character of the project, right? What you're saying is the business most likely absolutely needed that change, right? But the capabilities of the project team to deliver that change were low. So what would happen based on your predictions, your scenario, is that program team would achieve some kind of churn or change in the team, because the program or the business would still require that change to happen.
Yeah, so there is there are two scenarios. In the one that the case study I showed, the stakeholders are actively distancing themselves from the program. So you can imagine what happened after that. There is another situation where the stakeholders don't distance themselves because they really want and they're really engaged, but delivery is still an issue. And this is where you get the sort of the program team changes and the program goes into recovery. Now I do have a case study for that, which I wrote up as a paper on my LinkedIn profile, because back in January 2019, I thought it'd be fun to take Brexit as a change program and put that through the diagnostic to see what would happen. And this wasn't about whether Brexit was a good thing or a bad thing. It was really just looking at it from a change function. And the 4 predictions it came out with, and this is while Theresa May was still Prime Minister, was that there would be a change in the senior leadership team, that the programme would get an extension of time and money, that a solution would be dragged over the line to hit the deadline, and then there'd be an extensive period of remediation to get it to work. And I would argue that all 4 of those, well, the first 3 definitely happened.
It's uncanny.
And I guess we're in stage 4 now.
Yeah.
So, and I've written that up as an article for people to consume.
And that's on your LinkedIn profile.
That's on my LinkedIn profile. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that is uncanny. So what you're saying is small, medium, or very large national change program. If you put in the factors around that change program, then the nature of change, based on those variables, the nature of change is, broadly speaking, you can check the direction of that change.
Yes, because programs follow scenarios, and the scenarios themselves are predictable.
That is uncanny. Yeah.
Yeah, we've also got it on the resource page as well as the
Great.
I'm conscious of time and that everybody's about to finish their butties, and so if anybody's got any urgent questions to try and to ask John or us before we wind up and move on to the resource page, fire them through on the questions. I think we've covered most of them that people were asking. Quite interactive, which was good. In that, we move forward, and Shade, your moment of glory.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as we indicated,
one quick question.
Sorry,
one quick question from Jeremy: is the model open for general use? Jeremy asks.
Sorry, what was the question?
Is the model open for general use?
Yes, the general capability diagnostic is available on my website. If people want to use the program specific one, if they could connect with me on LinkedIn, I can set them up and we can give them access to that.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you very much, John. That's appreciated. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, as we indicated at the beginning of the webinar, what we prepare each week is a resource page, and the resource page this week revolves around predicting transformation program success with our guest speaker, Jon Crews, director at Projonix. John's bio is there in the top right-hand corner, along with 2 smiley faces from myself and Steve with our contact details. If you want to follow up on today's subject or in any of the library topics, the 40-odd webinars which we've recorded and are in the repository, the link to which will be supplied to all of you who are attending today. Please take a look at the subject. If you've got any queries on this or previous weeks, we'd be happy to engage with you on that. On the left-hand side, you're going to see 2 case studies which will be recorded with John around predicting program success. The first is ensuring success for change programs. There's a link to a case study there, which will take you further into that topic. And the second is, how does Brexit fare as a change program? So as John has indicated, he actually applied his model to Brexit as a change program with predictions and outcomes which have proven uncannily accurate. So we thank you for documenting that as well, John. On the right-hand side, you're going to see additional useful resources. So we've got successful determinants. So what is it that makes up a successful program? What are the compositions and the factors and the resources which will help you to launch a successful change program? The variance models for change, predicting change, and taking back control, depending on where you are inside that program. There's also, in the more info section at the bottom, what you'll find is we engage with a lot of thought leadership from Deloitte, PwC, Accenture, around their research, around their white papers, around programs and successful change programs. And so you'll see links there as well if you want to dive into the subject. All of this resource is free, is for you to take away if you want to share it with your colleagues or if you want to develop your own material from it. On the left-hand side in the bottom, you will see the our teaser for our next week's webinar. It's inspired by the independents. So what is it that we can learn from independents in this changing world that we're all living in, and in this business cycle that we're all operating in. That will be next February the 17th, next Wednesday at 12:30 again. We encourage you, please do join us next week. And if you've enjoyed the program, please share it amongst your network and encourage others to join us as well on this journey. With that, I would personally like to thank Jon Crews very much. Thank you, Jon, for sharing what I think personally, and I hope for our audience, has been a real insight into how can we help change programs in the organizations we all work in. We're all involved, we're all stakeholders, we're sometimes shareholders, but also sometimes we're active participants in change. And it would be great if we can lend some insight which might help the successful outcome of that change program to our businesses and our communities. So thank you from me, Jon, appreciate it. I'll hand over now to Steve for closing comments.
Yeah, thanks, Shade. Yeah, as always, yeah, thanks very much, Jon. Really interesting, and particularly really interesting on the resource page, the link to Brexit. I'm going to have a read of that. It's quite interesting. Good interaction. Thanks everybody for all of your questions, your comments. Great to keep it interactive, which is marvelous. Yes, next week, inspired by the independents, we have our guest next week is Claire Bailey, who's worked very closely with some of the government organisations from the high streets, and you'll see her regularly appearing as a commentator on retail on the news and other current affairs and consumer programmes. So she's it'll be really interesting to see what we can learn from how some of these independents have had to dramatically change their business in the last year in order to survive and then to thrive. So that should be quite interesting. So with that, thanks, Jon. Thank you, Shade, as always. Thanks to the rest of the team, Lucas, Claire, and Joanna, and look forward to it all next week. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.